I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics, messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for February the 13th, 2026. On Monday, we started on our theology roundup a multi-part series going through the issue of one law or one Torah theology. This is one of those controversies which gets a lot of people in today's Messianic community very anxious, very nervous, upset, and disappointed. The main focus of our attention is going to be, has been, on different passages in the Torah or the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, which detail something involving one law or one statute, applying to, in some way, the native and sojourner in ancient Israel. One of the things I think we have very quickly discovered, especially yesterday and on Wednesday, is that many of those who stridently identify as holding to a one law or one Torah theology have taken some of these passages out of context. They will liberally or affluently quote things, one law for the native and the sojourner, but then they don't take into consideration the original context of what that meant for ancient Israel in terms of the jurisprudence of the Torah. And while there is some necessary shifting which needs to take place with strident proponents of a one law or one Torah theology, which many of them are not open to, many are resistant, many are prideful and even arrogant. I don't want to underplay the fact that there are a lot of people out there in the Messianic Jewish sphere of influence who, while condemning a one law or one Torah theology, oh, we're not one law, we're not one Torah, they haven't provided any kind of an alternative interpretation or approach to those various passages which discuss one law or one statute. There might be a lot of condemnation of one law or one Torah theology, legalism, judgmentalism, rigidity, etc. But there is a phobia on the part of many to go into these passages and evaluate what they meant for ancient Israel and the jurisprudence of the Torah for ancient Israel. And that is every bit as much of a problem. So our purpose behind this study is to go into these passages and, of course, review them the best we can. Is it easy? No, it is not easy. One has to be very brave because of all the emotions which go into it. But nevertheless, I do believe that resolving this is at least somewhat possible. Because there have been a lot of people out there who, non-Jewish believers, the Lord has genuinely, supernaturally drawn them into things like Shabbat or the festivals or a kosher style of diet. That does not mean that one has to hold to a quote unquote one law theology, which I myself am very critical of. All right, so let's get into our material. I just want to briefly state, one of the reasons we got, kind of stretched the introduction out is the way X, formerly Twitter, is posting the live stream. I have to actually go into my X feed, paste the description of the episode, and then retweet it. It's not just coming up automatically in the feed. So, technology changes all the time, right? Okay, please go with me to the Messianic Apologetics website. Click on the Articles tab and scroll down to the letter O, Approaching One Law Controversies, sorting through the legalism. Click there, and then this is where we left off yesterday with Leviticus 24:22, which is another passage where, in this case, we see the terminology one standard, where there is some context, which of course has to be considered. And I'm going to emphasize something very clear as we go through each of these passages. There is a cumulative effect regarding what they mean in terms of the native and sojourner in ancient Israel. And we're going to be discussing that after we get through these passages and what they mean for us theologically in the scope of the Torah or the Pentateuch. And what we will find is native and sojourner in ancient Israel had far more in common than not. That is not something you often will hear emphasized in certainly hard shell bilateral ecclesiology, Messianic Jewish quarters. And indeed, much of today's Messianic culture and even one law Torah culture, Hebrew roots culture, the whole spectrum of views, it does tend to emphasize differences over common faith. And I do believe that's wrong. All right, let's get into our material. Leviticus 24:22. There shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as the native, for I am the Lord your God. New American Standard. Leviticus 24:22 actually asserts mishpat echad yeheh, employing the term mishpat, which has a wide range of meanings throughout the Hebrew scriptures: decision, judgment, legal claim, measure, or law, lowercase, from the Kaler-Baumgartner lexicon. Mishpat echad is rendered in modern versions as one standard, excuse me, New American Standard, New Jewish Publication Society version, the same rule, English Standard Version, the same standard of judgment, Complete Jewish Bible, the same law, New International Version, and one law, Revised Standard Version, New Revised Standard. Even though mishpat is used here and not the term Torah, this should not be considered to be a problem. That there was to be mishpat echad appeared within a series of regulations pertaining to the execution of criminals, and in seeing how restitution was to be made to a plaintiff for a variety of crimes, often referred to by the Latin lex talionis, or law of retaliation. The idea of one standard of rule to be applicable within ancient Israel for both Ezrach, or native, and Ger, or sojourner, is substantiated in Leviticus 24:10 through 23 by some very important examples. So let's go through this passage, because Leviticus 24:22 appears within a context of some specific statements. Now, the son of an Israelite woman, whose father was an Egyptian, went out among the sons of Israel, and the Israelite woman's son and a man of Israel struggled with each other in the camp. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name and cursed. So they brought him to Moses. Excuse me. Now his mother's name was Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri of the tribe of Dan. They put him in custody so that the command of the Lord might be made clear to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Bring the one who has cursed outside the camp, and let all who heard him lay their hands on his head. Then let all the congregation stone him. You shall speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if anyone curses his God, then he will bear his sin. Moreover, the one who blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall certainly stone him. The alien as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death. If a man takes the life of any human being, he shall be put to death. The one who takes the life of an animal shall make it good, life for life. If a man injures his neighbor, just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured a man, so it shall be inflicted on him. Thus, the one who kills an animal shall make it good, but the one who kills a man shall be put to death. There shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as the native, for I am the Lord your God. Then Moses spoke to the sons of Israel, and they brought the one who had cursed outside the camp and stoned him with stones. Thus the sons of Israel did, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Leviticus 24:10 through 23, New American Standard. So it's clear enough from what we've just examined that the statement of Leviticus 24:22 regarding there shall be one standard for you was delivered in a specific context. And of course, we are dealing with the jurisprudence of ancient Israel. So, how do we sort through this? I'm sorry. I know that we have, a lot of emotions go into this, but you just can't quote, there shall be one standard for you without considering some of the wider statements being made and how they not only affect the jurisprudence of the Torah, but how some of these matters have been affected by the realities of the post resurrection era. Okay. Admittedly, much more attention in this passage may be given by some Christian commentators and interpreters to the statement, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and the instruction regarding damages, Leviticus 24:17 through 21, given its reference present in Yeshua's Sermon on the Mount teaching, Matthew 5:38 following. Then what one standard or one rule meant in terms of regulating ancient Israel. Yet, the law of retaliation was a definite part of how Mishpat Echad was to be understood for the native and sojourner within Israel. The ruling that Mishpat Echad was to apply was primarily made because of a severe incident which occurred within the broad populace of ancient Israel. The wilderness camp of Israel was undeniably mixed. Exodus 12:38, Deuteronomy 23:7 and 8. A crime was committed, and there was doubt regarding how proper punishment was to be issued. One whose father was an Egyptian and mother was an Israelite cursed the name of the God of Israel while in a fight. What was to be done? He was placed into custody until a decision could be made. Leviticus 24:10 through 12. As is typical in jurisprudence, high crimes, and not necessarily lesser issues, set the precedent for rulings, practices, and even social norms which will affect an entire scope of legal and ethical matters, and the way a culture acts toward its law. Serious and severe situations, here, like blasphemy against the divine name, or even significant compensation for another's property loss or injuries made, create the need for overarching precedents to be established. Notable to be considered here was not that this half Egyptian, half Israelite person could have been considered exempt from punishment for blasphemy. He was guilty of blasphemy. But as John F. Hartley points out, quote, the question before the community was not the guilt of the half-breed, but what was the appropriate penalty by reason of his ambivalent social standing, unquote. Could this man, because he was not a fully born Israelite, possibly be given a lesser or more likely a severer sentence for his crime? The divine injunction issued by God to Moses was that there was to be no difference in the penalty for blaspheming the divine name, as both the native Israelite as well as the sojourner were to be stoned to death. Numbers 24:13 through 16. The need for a uniform penalty in this instance was rather obvious, given the magnitude of the offense. Derek Tidball states how, quote, full Israelite, half Israelite, or alien, the brazen insolence shown to the sacred name of God and all that it stood for could in no way be tolerated, unquote. Readers are not exactly told in which way the half-Egyptian, half-Israelite man actually blasphemed the Lord, even though the verb nakav appearing in the call stem, simple action, active voice, can mean to slander, the Kaler-Baumgartner lexicon, or curse, execrate, the Holiday lexicon. Details of what might have been said are left out, but we could speculate on how someone with a partial Egyptian heritage might have claimed something about Yud-He-Vav-He being a god of slaves or rabble, or how he was somehow weak and impotent for leading his people into the desert to rot. Exodus 14, 11, and 12, equating to a kind of curse. Still, what was more likely in a fit of rage was the usage of the divine name as a slur via the employment of some ancient equivalent of, and those of you see the notes here, GD. Okay, you all know what that is. Regardless of how the crime was actually committed, there can be no disputing that the same death penalty was applicable for anyone within the camp of Israel. Martin Note explains, quote, the special feature of the case in Leviticus 24:10 following consists in this: a foreigner has cursed the name of God, and the decision goes forth that there is the same law for foreigners and natives, and that cursing the name of God is for a foreigner too an offense worthy of death, unquote. Not to be overlooked in this scene is whether this blasphemer even claimed to follow Israel's God, or whether he was just in the community of Israel because of his mother's Israelite heritage. Hartley indicates, quote, blasphemy against foreign gods was not considered a serious matter in ancient Israel, unquote. An example of which is some of the speech witnessed in Judges 6, 25 to 32, and the mockery made against the Canaanite god Baal. It might have been that if the half-Egyptian, half-Israelite had cursed and said something like, may Ra or Horus, Osiris, or some other Egyptian god strike you down, he could have gotten off with some kind of a lesser sentence. Like having to go perform some manual labor, garbage collection, or dig latrines and gather up animal waste, as these false gods were humiliated by the Lord in the judgment on Egypt. And the man would only look stupid. But because the God of the Exodus was somehow invoked improperly, capital punishment was necessary. Among interpreters, Hartley's conclusion is, quote, this group of laws, Leviticus 24, 10 through 23, excuse me, was to underscore the standard that those of mixed blood and foreigners living in Israel are subject to the laws of blasphemy, whether or not they worship Yahweh as their God, unquote. Certainly, for the community of ancient Israel wandering in the desert, no person needed to hear any curse issued against him or in his name go unpunished, regardless of who said it. Sorry. As Baruch A. Levine astutely explains, quote, non-Israelites are responsible for acts considered vital to maintaining the religious character of the community. Therefore, offenses that threaten the overall religious character are punishable, even when committed by non-Israelite residents, unquote. If the half-Egyptian, half-Israelite man here were really not as true a follower of the Lord as most others in the community, and he was to be executed for blasphemy, then how significant would it have been for true followers of the Lord, whether native born or sojourner, to have been shown the same standard if they were to blaspheme? Kol ha-edah, or all the congregation, Leviticus 24:14, was required to see that a blasphemer was stoned to death. And no statement was made here about only the native born being a part of the real assembly. The sojourners within the community of Israel were treated as though they already acknowledged the Lord as the one true God, and they had to enact the capital punishment as well. Everyone, whether native or sojourner, had something to lose if blasphemy against the Lord were allowed to persist in the camp of ancient Israel. The severity of blasphemy is something witnessed not only in the Pentateuch, being condemned by the third commandment, Exodus 20, verse 7, and how cursing God is clearly prohibited, Exodus 22:28, but how capital punishment was employed later in the Tanakh, 1 Kings 21:10, 13. In the apostolic scriptures, we see how false charges of blasphemy were issued against Yeshua the Messiah and the martyr Stephen, for which they were unjustly murdered. Matthew 26, 65 and 66, Acts 6:11 following. Immediately after the instructions detailing the execution of the half Egyptian, half Israelite blasphemer are given, Leviticus 24:10 through 16, laws regarding retaliation, lex talionis, are seen, with the exception of capital punishment for murder issued first. These were to largely regulate lesser crimes or negative actions which may have manifested themselves in ancient Israel. Leviticus 24:17 through 21. What need not elude us between this eye for eye, tooth for tooth instruction in the Torah is how capital punishment was not prescribed for every offense. If an animal killed a human being, its owner was not to be executed, although in making restitution, Leviticus 24:21, New International Version, New Jewish Publication Society Version, New Revised Standard, rendering the Hebrew shalem, it may be that not only was the animal to be put to death, but some kind of material reparation was to be offered to the deceased families. Only the exact circumstances could tell. Gordon J. Wenham is keen to explain to how this ran contrary to much of what would be seen in the contemporary bodies of law and the ancient Near East. Quote, throughout the ancient Orient, the death penalty was imposed for a wider variety of crimes than currently in Western society. This applies to the Old Testament as much as the Mesopotamian systems. But whereas the laws of Hammurabi regard property offenses and similar crimes as capital, the Old Testament does not. And the Old Testament's eyes, sins against the family and religion are the most serious, and hence often attract the death penalty, whereas economic matters are treated more lightly. Unquote. What makes the Torah's instruction on the laws of damages so significant, although there would have been variance within the other law codes of the ancient Near East, is that there was no blanket capital punishment specified for all offenses. Within the lex talionis of Leviticus 24:17 through 21, there were instances beyond that of executing a murderer, which would have had to be considered on a case-by-case basis. Leviticus 24:18 through 21 in particular may be considered some ad hoc examples of where just restitution was to be provided for an offender. And I'm going to pause there for just a moment. How many of you, in seeing there shall be one standard for you, mishpat echad, talked about by some, strident proponent of a one law or one Torah theology, and they go into these details? How many of you have ever seen that? Or how many of you have just seen Leviticus 24:22 quoted on some meme without any consideration for its ancient context? We've got some smart people who identify as being one law or one Torah, but yet they just jump through a lot of the actual places where one law, or in this case, one standard, one statute is used. And that's one of the reasons why we've got some of the challenges and even some of the problems we've got today. Now, it is also true, and I said this at the beginning, there are people in Messianic Judaism, oh, we don't hold a one law theology. And they're not willing to get involved with, okay, what does a statement like Leviticus 24:22, in the context here, what does that mean? And what do you interpret it to mean? There are some phobias present among people. We don't need to be afraid of getting into the Torah's jurisprudence. With Moses having told the ancient Israelites that the half Egyptian, half Israelite man was to be stoned for blasphemy, Leviticus 24:16, and having delivered instruction on restitution for damages, he then spoke forth the Lord's word. You are to have the same law, mishpat echad, for the alien and the native born. I am the Lord your God. Leviticus 24:22, New International Version. Following this, the blasphemer was stoned to death. Leviticus 24:23. Okay, now let's get into some of the jurisprudence here. There is no indication in Leviticus 24:22 that the ger or sojourner was to be held to a different standard than the native born of Israel, certainly as it involved serious matters such as those detailed in Leviticus 24:10 through 21. So Leviticus 24:22 right here, you got to put it in context, Leviticus 24:10 through 21. Outsiders who entered into the community of ancient Israel face the same responsibilities and penalties as anyone else, especially in terms of capital offenses. In Richard Elliott Friedman's estimation of this scene, quote, the account therefore has the value of not only dramatizing the law concerning blasphemy, but also of dramatizing the principle of equality before the law, unquote, from his commentary on the Torah. The equality which native and sojourner within ancient Israel had before the Torah would have been most significant because, as Levine argues, quote, the term mishpat regards a, quote, norm of justice, describing the situation must be made specific because of the practice in certain legal systems of judging resident aliens by a different law, and that's lowercase law, unquote. There was to be no uncertainty present in terms of what measure of law the ger was to be held accountable to. He or she was not going to be held to a completely different scale, be that scale more harsh or more lenient. The further thoughts of J.H. Hertz should also be well taken. Quote, in no other code was there one and the same law for native born and alien alike. Even in Roman law, every alien was originally classified as an enemy and therefore devoid of any rights. Only gradually was the protection of the law extended to him. It is not so very long ago, and this is from Hertz's 1960 edition of Pentateuch and Haftorahs, that aliens in European states were incapable of owning landed property. In many countries, the denial by the dominant race of civic and politic rights to aliens, though these may have lived for generations in a land of their sojourn, is a matter of contemporary history, unquote, from Pentateuch and Haftorahs. And of course, it should go without saying that many of those observations pertain to the Jewish community in Europe. Realizing that the Torah was indeed going to hold all within the community of God to the same basic standard, whether native of Israel or sojourner, would have gone a long way in an ancient time, when generally speaking, there would have been at least two sets of standards in place for the natives of a country, and then any outsiders who had entered in, even to just temporarily work. And not only would the native born and outsider be held to two different standards, but most likely, quote unquote, natives within ancient Near Eastern societies would have different scales of law for the aristocracy, the rich, and the poor. And the different monarchies perceived as divine or at least semi-divine might not have even been accountable to the law in some cases. Samuel E. Ballantyne lauds the significance of the Leviticus 24 instruction for both its theological and civic contributions. Quote, legal statutes that demanded penalties commensurate with the damage done effectively erased the inequalities of the rich and the poor, the person of rank and the commoner, thus enabling a more egalitarian judicial system. Those with wealth could not pay their way out of punishment by compensating their victims. Those without could not claim special exemption simply because they could not make a monetary restitution for their offense. The author of Leviticus 24 may have seized on this egalitarian legal principle to buttress the theological conviction that the same law must apply to the native Israelite and the resident alien, unquote. Recognizing the significance of mishpat echad, or one standard being held, is key for any reading of the Pentateuch. R.K. Harrison is most correct. Quote, these regulations applied uniformly to all members of the nation, whatever their racial origin, and, like other enactments, carried the assurance of God's imprimatur, unquote. Now listen very carefully, because one of the, and I do believe, one of the significant errors of those who identify as holding to a one law or one Torah theology, because here in Leviticus 24, we're dealing with equal treatment of the native and sojourner in ancient Israel in the matter of, first of all, blasphemy against the God of Israel and the law of damages. So one law proponents will then just go and extrapolate, well, there's no difference of any kind between native and sojourner in ancient Israel. And that is simply not true. That's not a sustainable position from reading the text of the Torah. They were to be shown equality in these high matters of Torah jurisprudence, blasphemy against the God of Israel, the laws of damages, but there's something which a lot of people don't often consider here. In the case of Leviticus 24, 10 through 21, and the issues in view, the only disadvantage to the ger, the sojourner, would probably have been how some sojourners who had entered into ancient Israel at a later point in life were less likely to know what the code of conduct was than those native-born who had been exposed to it their entire lives. Although in some circumstances, there were probably native-born Israelites who knew the Torah's legal code less than some sojourners. Okay? So if you were someone who had been native-born of Israel, you had been exposed to the Torah's code of conduct your entire life, in all probability, you understood and appreciated that code of conduct a whole lot more than someone, a sojourner, who entered into the community in later life and was not as familiar with that code of conduct, and in some cases may not have even been aware of certain regulations. So picking up, this is why righteous judges would have to be appointed in the towns of Israel, Deuteronomy 16:18 and 25:1, so that when crimes were committed, a proper investigation could be conducted. If this was done properly, then those truly ignorant of the law or the law's lesser known injunctions could still be dealt with fairly. Still, the job of all people within a society, especially that of ancient Israel, which was given the Torah, preparing to enter into the promised land, is to not be ignorant of the statutes which govern it. Okay, now I've got some critical observations to make about one law or one Torah theology here. When supporters of a one law or one Torah theology quote Leviticus 24:22, you shall have one law for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God, Revised Standard Version, the principle of equality for the native and sojourner before the jurisprudence of God's Torah should not fear us. Leviticus 24:10 through 21 lists a series of instances where in societies contemporary to ancient Israel, natives to an ancient Near Eastern state and sojourners who had entered in were likely to be held to very different standards in the law codes. The God of Israel, quite contrary to this, was fair and just to those within his community. However, and emphasizing that all of God's people should be studying and heeding God's Torah, those of the one law or one Torah submovement have made a mistake in invoking Leviticus 24:22 as a prime verse for one to focus their attention around. So this involves theology and it involves spirituality. Listen very carefully, please. Leviticus 24:22 was given as a summarizing remark in view of blasphemy committed in ancient Israel, for which capital punishment would be issued equally, as well as various damages, for which serious rulings for sure would have to be decided. For the spiritually discerning among us, it is not difficult for us to see how, in centering spiritual attention around passages like Leviticus 24:22, why legalism, judgmentalism, and a condemnatory spirit tend to persist in the one law or one Torah submovement. Think about that for a moment. If you're focusing your spiritual attention around Leviticus 24:22, which in context regarding uniform capital punishment for native and sojourner, as well as the laws of damages, if that is where your spiritual credo is centered, not love your neighbor as yourself, something more foundational. If it's about one standard for the native and sojourner, oh, and by the way, that pertains to execution for blasphemy against the God of Israel. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why legalism, judgmentalism, condemnation, a lack of the work of the Holy Spirit persists in many sectors which stridently identify as one law or one Torah. Not difficult to figure that out. While Leviticus 24:10 through 22 surely includes important legal principles which Bible readers need to take serious note of, today's born-again believers in Messiah Yeshua also need to seriously factor in his completed work for us, especially in being sacrificed for the capital crimes of the Torah. Colossians 2:14, right? Yeshua took those penalties onto himself in his sacrifice on the tree. This is why there is a definite advantage at focusing our spiritual attention instead around passages like Jeremiah 31 to 34, or Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27, which promise not just a supernatural transcription of God's Torah onto the heart, but most imperatively, a permanent forgiveness and cleansing from transgressions. Indeed, one of the main reasons why I do not hold to a one law or one Torah theology is why, in my right mind, would I focus my spiritual attention around a passage like one standard for the native and sojourner when that standard was uniform capital punishment? When Yeshua the Messiah and his sacrifice absorbed that capital punishment onto himself for you and me. And we live in a post-resurrection era where capital punishment is largely a thing of the past. And indeed, I believe in the abrogation of all capital punishment. I believe that, for myself, I believe that it's to be regarded as a part of the pre-resurrection era. And that is one of the main reasons why in 2010, I largely broke with some of the people out there who were strongly pushing one law, one Torah theology, because we live in a post-resurrection era. The capital punishment was nailed to the cross with him, Colossians 2:14. That's why we don't execute sinners today. How important is the Messiah event to you? But that doesn't all of a sudden mean that God's Torah, the standard of holiness, is a thing of the past. No, the new covenant is about God writing his instruction onto a new heart and a new mind and compelling obedience by the work of the Holy Spirit and growing in holiness, which is, of course, what you have seen among many people, many Jewish believers for certain, and non-Jewish believers supernaturally called, summoned by the Lord into the Messianic community during this hour. So I think this is something which is very important for you all to keep in mind. And as I have said, this study is cumulative. Now, next time, so this would be Monday, we're going to continue. We will be reviewing Numbers 9:14. Let me go back to the screen. Yeah, Numbers 9:14. You shall have one statute, both for the alien and for the native of the land. So this likewise was delivered within some kind of original ancient context. So we'll be getting into that. And look, maybe I have to repeat it again. And I think this is, for me, as a Bible teacher, as an examiner, as an interpreter, as an exegete, this is what makes this debate really frustrating for me. There's some really smart people who, around the turn of the millennium, made this whole issue very, very simple. And it's actually not simple. You have to, because they just wanted to market, there shall be one law for the native and the sojourner. There are specific contexts in which that statement appeared. And now, a quarter of a century later, we're really having to clean up some of the messes which they made. And we're having to also deal with the phobia of some people. We don't believe in one law, who refuse to, okay, if you don't believe in it, what do you think about these passages then? Provide an alternative approach to them. And it's very frustrating. I mean, every generation has to deal with what the previous generation left to it, right? And I've reached the point in my own life where I have to continually forgive some of the short-sighted mistakes which some old men who preceded me made, and it's very difficult, especially in this area. And are we ever going to be able to resolve this fairly? Well, a big part of the new covenant, and I'll close with this before we get into the news roundup, a big part of the new covenant is making sure that you not only have a heart which has been transformed by God's Holy Spirit, one which loves him and loves neighbor, which we're supposed to focus our attention around as born again men and women, but also that you have a mind imbued with the Holy Spirit. You can think more deeply. You can deal with more and more complicated issues. You don't have to just have a simple faith. After all, if we're supposed to be conformed to the image of Yeshua, and we believe that Yeshua created the universe, right? And that Yeshua is upholding the ages by the word of his power. That's Hebrews 1. That means that as we become more and more like Yeshua, who he is as the Lord, God, we're supposed to at least partially be able to think more deeply and get into details regarding his word. Well, this is a cumulative series, and they're going to be more that we're going to be talking about next week. All right, let's move on to our news roundup. Now, we have our news roundup after the theology roundup because the news is, of course, time sensitive and it changes from day to day. For example, when people go to this back episode in the future, they're going to be looking at approaching one law controversies, Leviticus 24:22. They're not necessarily going to be accessing it for the news roundup, even though there'll be some interesting things to say, not solely focused on, number one, how we need to be praying for peace, Israel, Gaza, the Middle East, the Iranian situation. Number two, be praying for peace, Russia, Ukraine. And number three, be praying for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front, the Western Hemisphere, etc. And we've got stories from today that pretty much cover all of those areas. Okay, so All the news stories I'm about to go through, these are things which I encounter passively on social media. I don't go out and hunt for them. These are things which just, come across my feed, and I catalog them mainly from X, formerly Twitter, maybe a little bit of Instagram. And indeed, okay, and all of these links, you'll be able to look at them later today when this episode is archived at messianicapologetics.net. So you can go read the articles in their entirety, watch the different clips, etc. Okay, our first story is from 2C TV. This is from 1:45 p.m. yesterday, so this would have been when we were streaming yesterday. 50-second clip. President Trump on Iran. We have to make a deal, otherwise it is going to be very traumatic. Okay, now we know that the Iranian situation is ever-changing. There is a buildup of U.S. naval forces in the region, similar to what we saw building up north of Venezuela in the South Caribbean Sea. Now, with that stated, while talks, negotiations between the United States and Iran are ongoing, Prime Minister Netanyahu was recently in Washington expressing some of his thoughts to the president. The president says, look, they need to make a deal, otherwise it's going to be very traumatic. So it's not just like, well, we're having talks with the Iranians on their nuclear aspirations and their missile program and everything else. No, if they don't cut a deal with us, the results will be traumatic. Some of us would conclude catastrophic, disastrous. And the president has given broadly a timetable for this. We need to wait and see what's going to happen within the next month. Okay, our next story, and this is from I-24 News English, a 3-minute, 56-second clip. So here you have Ravin Khorshid Alam saying, we have silos of dead bodies that the regime is now burning to eliminate evidence. Speaking of the Islamic Republic. During the internet blackout, they killed 200,000 Iranians, according to the reports we are receiving. So here you have someone who's obviously Iranian. He's somebody who, Ravin Khorshid Alam, he's supportive of the, is he Iranian? Let's confirm that. But anyways, from the Middle East, obviously, somebody who is expressing the opinion, at least from reports he has, that many, many people have been murdered by the Iranian regime. And that was picked up by I-24 News in English yesterday, 2:30 p.m., 12:30 p.m., while we were streaming. Okay. But that's the kind of information, and we don't know how accurate or inaccurate it is. He's just passing things on. But we have to be aware of some of that as we sort through the Iranian situation. This is very serious. The Islamic Republic has blood on its hands. And my opinion of what is occurring with the buildup of U.S. forces in the region is that, in all probability, just as we saw with what took place in Venezuela, the president wants there to be, quick, decisive action, not some kind of a long, drawn-out conflict as we had seen in, previous conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran. We need a quick, decisive action because the American people don't have the stomach for, long, drawn-out wars. But they can, quick victory, absolutely. Okay. From Zero Hedge, this is something having to do with technology. This was posted yesterday, February the 12th. Microsoft AI CEO warns most white-collar jobs fully automated within next 12 to 18 months. Anthropic fears potential for heinous crimes. Okay, so that's the, you can watch this interview. I certainly watched it. this brief clip, the man leading Microsoft's AI sprawling efforts is sounding the alarm over imminent mass labor disruptions, warning that the overwhelming majority of white-collar professional work could vanish to automation far sooner than most businesses and policy leaders are willing to admit. So, okay, we know, just like with anything involving technology, technology changes. One of the big things people are having to deal with right now is artificial intelligence. And of course, we're dealing with something that's way more involved than just, spell check, doing some kind of an internet search, or, even, for example, taking a video and having AI break it up into, different clips. We're just flat talking about having a computer, take over some of the reasoning white collar professional jobs, which, people go to college, they go to graduate school to possibly do. And, what are we going to see in the next year and a half? Well, here you've got some speculation from the Microsoft AI CEO. We'll wait and see. We'll wait and see. But I know that a lot of people are very concerned about the presence of these kinds of technologies, and right, they are concerned about how much of the human factor is going to be eliminated because a computer, no matter how advanced it is, does not have the intuition of a human being made in God's image. All right, here's something which I thought very useful to pass on to you. Okay, so this is a conference which is going to be held in the first week of April, and it's the Christ is King conference in Temple, Texas. Now, the conclusion of this post is that God, once I ask again, please permanently remove every one of these men from public life, show your power, expose them, humble them, silence them. And at the Christ is King conference, you have among those in attendance, here you have Calvin Robinson. There you have Joel Webbin. There you have Brian Suave. All three of those gentlemen, specifically, we have referred to on Messianic Insider as promoting anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Just this week, Calvin Robinson claiming that the Star of David is a pagan symbol. Here you have Joel Webbin, very, hyper replacement theology, hyper supersessionist. Brian Suave openly saying that the Talmud should be burned because it has some negative things to say about Jesus. We got to keep this in mind as a Messianic community, this kind of growing, Christian nationalist, with all the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism associated with it. Now, one of the things which came across my path last night, and you hear some of these people, mainly Brian Suave, to a lesser extent, Joel Webbin. There are some people, and this is very concerning. Thankfully, I don't have to deal with the fallout from it. But there are some people on the fringes of the emerging pro-Nomian or pro-Nomian Christian movement. Some of you are more familiar with it as pronomian, but I was always taught Nomos is with a short O. Bill Patrick, Asbury Seminary, said you pronounce the Omicron as an A sound, not an O sound. Okay, so that's why I say pronomian. But the point is, you got some people on the fringes of pronomian Christianity, which itself is not a mainstream movement. I'm sorry to say that, who adhere to some of those ideas. And I found out that someone who had been involved with the publication of some pronomian books, has gone full tilt into a lot of the, anti-Talmud, anti-Zionist conspiracies. So I don't want to dig up a lot of that dirt. As I said, it's not something I have to deal with because I am part of the Messianic Jewish community. No ambiguity. We stand with Israel. We stand with the Jewish people. I absolutely have on my list, how do you sort through various passages in the Talmud, which seemingly say some bad things, but other people have dealt with that. I've got to give it, my approach sometime in the future. I got other things to work on right now. But with all this, no ambiguity. We stand with Israel. We stand with the Jewish people. We stand against the anti-Semitism and the anti-Zionism. Whereas, and I'm willing to give because of, acquaintances I've had over the years from people who now identify as pro-Namian, they need to have a few years to figure out who they are and what they stand for. But from the very beginning, I've said, where are they going to stand regarding issues of Messianic Judaism, the state of Israel, Zionism, Jewish tradition, this sort of thing. We wait and see. All right, so our next story. This is from Open Source Intel. This is his commentary from 4:33 p.m. yesterday. Apparently, the Midnight Hammer memo didn't register with the Islamic regime. The mullahs are going to be begging Allah to stop Trump's Midnight Hammer 2.0. It looks like it's coming. So Open Source Intel, he does pass on a lot of information, a lot of news stories. I recommend you follow him on X. Highly recommend you follow him on X, and even to the point of send him a free coffee. Send him $5, $10, $20. Let him know you appreciate what he's doing, because that is an important service he's performing, and he's Jewish from New York, lives in Israel now. Very good source. Yeah. That's his opinion. But are we going to have Midnight Hammer 2.0? If Iran does not come to some kind of an arrangement with the United States over their nuclear aspirations and the ballistic missiles, even the president has said the consequences will be traumatic. All right. So from 2C TV, speaking of that, this is from 4:50 p.m. yesterday. There's 2-minute, 28-second clip. While talks dominate headlines, military preparations continue. The Israeli Navy just completed a large-scale multi-vessel drill alongside recent joint U.S.-Israel exercises. Okay, and scrolling down to his commentary, the real obstacle isn't Washington or Jerusalem, it's the Islamic Republic, now cornered between accepting crippling terms or facing escalating pressure. So yeah, this situation continues to build. The pressure continues to build. Now we're going to change gears ever so slightly to Russia and Ukraine. Visegrad 24. This was posted 4:46 p.m. yesterday, referencing an article from The Atlantic. Vladimir Zelensky, I would rather not conclude any agreement at all than force my people to accept a bad one. So here you see some things which have been sorted through before. However, this is what we really need to be paying attention to. The Atlantic reports that Ukraine may agree to the most difficult concession to Russia's demands in order to end the war, giving up territories in the Donetsk region. Now listen to this. To grant legitimacy to such a compromise, Kiev is considering holding a referendum in the spring in which Ukrainians could vote on a peace plan that includes territorial concessions, the outlet writes. Okay, so of course we don't know what's going to happen, but we definitely pray for peace, Russia, Ukraine, and if they were to come to a possible agreement, would it have to involve Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, voting on the agreement in some kind of a referendum? Okay. From Eyal Yacobi, this has got a lot, not necessarily his post, but this has got a lot of traction on social media right now. Posted 1:21 p.m. yesterday, so as we were streaming, but breaking, President Trump gives Iran a month to strike a deal, and there's an 11-second clip with that. So some of us have been here before in the lead up to what is now called the 12-day war from last spring. Of course, this is something which can change at a moment's notice, but effectively, we need to be looking at what's going to take place the next month. Are we going to see some kind of a, well, we've been in talks, but they're not going anywhere. And then we wake up or we find out, actually found out about the Operation Midnight Hammer on a Saturday evening after I'd woke up from my nap, Shabbat after all, that U.S., we've entered in, we've come to the party. So we need to be paying very close attention to what could be occurring in the next month. That's very, very serious. All right, from the New York Post. Okay, we talked about this yesterday at least, but here's another headline. Pentagon orders second strike carrier group to prepare to deploy to Middle East. Report. And so here, of course, the Abraham Lincoln is already in the region. And here it talks about the USS George H.W. Bush currently conducting training exercises off the coast of Virginia and could be the carrier that ends up deploying. We now know that the Bush is not the one which is going to be sent into the region. But I mentioned that article because what do we need to remember? If you will recall, going back to last year, and there was the steady buildup, and then boom, Israel launched their strikes, Operation Rising Lion, and then later Operation Midnight Hammer, the U.S. with the B-2s. There was a series of buildups, negotiations, talk, but also we're moving this into place, we're moving that into place. There was some public seemingly disagreement between Netanyahu and Trump, which later turned out to be false. It was just theater. It was just show. It was diversionary. Here you hear that a second carrier group's going to be sent to the region, likely the George Bush. We know that's not the case. We're as civilians, we are not going to be given all of the information. We can speculate, we can guess, but actually, as I'm going to mention in a few moments, it's the Gerald Ford which is going into the zone. They're the ones who have been ordered to deploy to the Middle East. Okay. From 2CTV yesterday, 5:23 p.m., and there's a 3-minute, 19-second clip. Everything is moving at once. U.S.-Israel coordination, a louder EU, and now IAEA chief Rafael Grossi warning that Iran has buried highly enriched uranium and inspectors still lack access to key sites like Natanz and Fordo. After months of silence on the nuclear file, the narrative is back. Not because the threat is new, but because pressure is building. So, indeed, what is going to get the attention of people? The military buildup, even though what took place last year, the 12-day war was important, there's still stuff out there. And is Iran going to cooperate or not? All right, from the Jerusalem Post, here's a story from yesterday, the 12th of February. Trump says a deal with Iran could be struck over the next month. Meanwhile, Trump claimed that he was the best friend Israel ever had and stated that Herzog, that's Isaac Herzog, the president, should be ashamed for not pardoning Netanyahu. So, indeed, this is the kind of thing which can change on a moment's notice, but it's useful to read through this article to just get a handle, get a pulse for a lot of the dynamics which are in play here. All right, we're going to switch gears. Let's go all the way to the Far East. I thought this was very useful to pass on. This is from Eric Stockelbeck, 59-second clip. China is in the middle of a massive nuclear expansion, tripling its warhead count in just the past decade alone. This is unprecedented. So what is Beijing's communist regime up to? And is America facing a new Cold War with the Red Dragon? Okay, now, as it exists right now, as things exist right now, it's actually the Russian Federation that has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and then that's immediately followed by the United States. And then you've got, some of the other countries like, United Kingdom, France, India, Pakistan. China is just after the United States, but they don't have as many as they want to have, but they're quickly catching up to. So we got Russia, United States, China, which is only in the several hundred range, like probably 500 or 600 range. They're trying to catch up to the big boys, the US and Russia. And as I said, you got the others, United Kingdom, France, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and yes, Israel. But the president wants to see a great reduction, as we should all desire to see, in the number of nuclear weapons. Why do countries need nuclear weapons? You can't use them. So, yeah, there's a lot of speculation that we could be entering into a new Cold War with China. We don't know. Likewise, we know from the Olivet Discourse, we're going to go into a period of wars and rumors of wars. Likewise, from Paul and Thessalonians, while they're saying peace and safety, sudden destruction. I don't see any kind of a major military conflict between the West and China, but a Cold War II is possible, or a Cold War, 1.5. I mean, these are all the kinds of things that people in politics like to speculate about. I think that any kind of a conflict with China is going to be fought more on the economic front than it is going to be fought on the military front and on the tech front as well. But I did think it was important to pass this along. China, I mean, they see themselves as the oldest civilization on Earth, sort of the main hub of human civilization. So they want to catch up to the West, and they've got a long-term plan. And this is not going to be the last time we talk about the Chinese. Okay, we got 5 more stories, and then we will conclude. Okay, Protestia passes this along. This is from last night at 9:18 p.m., February 12th. The Church of England has voted 252 to 132 with 21 abstentions to cease efforts advancing LGBTQ acceptance in the church, along with blessing same-sex marriages after consensus between conservative and liberals could not be reached. And the conclusion is this is a major blow to the progressives. All right, now the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Sarah Mullally, she's the first female Archbishop of Canterbury. She's very progressive. She's now in her position, although it should go without saying, the last 2 bishops of Canterbury, Rowan Williams and then Justin Welby, they were very progressive too. So this is not limited to women. This is a male problem as well. But here, the Church of England, Anglicanism, will not have the same-sex marriages or same-sex blessings. Okay. That doesn't mean that you're not eventually going to be able to see it. And even though they voted for the Church of England as a whole, that doesn't stop, for example, there being some rogue priest or rogue rector marrying a homosexual couple or blessing them or doing something else. That's been going on in denominations for quite some time. Okay. Yes, from Visegrad 24. This was posted this morning at 1:00 a.m., February 13th. New York Times reports that the order has been given for the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group to sail from the Caribbean to the Middle East. Okay, and they're going to be joining the USS Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, right off of their successes in Venezuela, the Gerald R. Ford group is going to be going to the Middle East. So it's not the George H.W. Bush. And I simply point that out because this just goes to show you how military assets are not in the civilians' domain. They shift around as is determined by the Department of War and the president, the commander-in-chief. Things change. Things can change very, very quickly. All right. Visegrad 24, 3:33 a.m. last night. The next meeting between Russia, the United States, and Ukraine could take place as early as next week. According to Politico, Abu Dhabi or Miami are being considered as possible venues. All right, so of course, we don't know what's ultimately going to happen, but we definitely need to see this conflict come to an honorable conclusion. So we'll see what happens possibly next week. All right, some of you all are doubtlessly aware that right now, the Munich Security Conference is taking place in Germany, and that pulls in, a number of heads of state, foreign ministers, defense ministers, other, high-profile people. President Zelensky of Ukraine is there. The exiled crown prince of Iran, Pahlavi, is there. So there are going to be a lot of, similar to Davos, the World Economic Forum, but it's a little different. There are going to be, speeches and observations made about, the world order. And with that in mind, here you have a clip from Chancellor Merz of Germany. This was posted this morning, and there's 2-minute, 33-second. It is translated. He's speaking in German here, but Germany's Chancellor Merz says that the international order based on rights and rules no longer exists, and that China wants to be a leader in shaping the world. That's hardly a surprise based on what we talked about regarding their nuclear aspirations. Merz, the U.S.'s claim to leadership has been challenged and possibly lost. And of course, one of the big things which is being discussed, in addition to situation in Iran, Russia, Ukraine, is what do we do about the United States now and the second Trump term, and how that's affecting the world order. And I'm going to use that small o order. And along with that, there are a lot of people who are in Europe, like Germany has expressed, well, maybe Europe needs to develop its own nuclear deterrent. I mean, what kind of a world are we going to be living in the next, 4 to 10 years? After Trump leaves office, his successor enters into office, and we see some things play out both in the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, who cannot fight indefinitely. They're going to have to come to a conclusion with this. What kind of a world are we going to live in? What are we going to see in Europe just on these kinds of factors alone? And, the rise of China. And even though you might not think as an American, well, this really doesn't affect me directly right now, it's definitely going to affect you economically, because we do live in this interconnected world. Even if we see globalism diluted for a season because of whether it's the Trump tariffs or some of the Trump, Board of Peace, some of his other activities. Okay, our final story, and I encourage you to look through this. This is on Instagram from Stand With Us about Jeffrey Epstein. And I really appreciate that they're doing this. A new report about the Epstein files exposed how some popular media and quote unquote influencers are quick to spread hateful lies when there's a chance to smear Israel and the Jews. So you can go through this and you can see how it's not accurate at all to claim that Jeffrey Epstein was an agent for the government of Israel, when in fact a lot of the things that Jeffrey Epstein was doing were opposed to the government of Israel. But just because Jeffrey Epstein is a Jew, and there are some high-profile Jewish people in these Epstein files, people will use it as an opportunity to go after Israel, go after the Jews, when there are plenty of other things in the Epstein files which talk about other governments, non-Jewish people. I mean, it's just, you have to be very reasonable and as balanced as you can be in going into this. Corruption, human sin, these are not limited to any one source of people. But I'm glad Stand With Us mentioned this, and there are going to be other people who, as more and more documents, more than anything else, claims are made from this, we'll have to pass them on. So we have had an interesting week. We live in a very quickly changing time. There are a lot of things happening right now which should garner our attention. They should garner our prayers. We have access as believers to the infinite power of heaven. I pray every day, first thing, Lord, protect me from threats known and unknown. And indeed, only the Lord knows what's going to ultimately happen, but we have an important role to play as the Messianic community. I am doing my best to facilitate stability. We don't need to avoid some of these uncomfortable and inconvenient matters, but we do need to be praying for the Messianic community, that more people would be paying attention, the more people would be pressing into the Lord, that, like in our theology, we don't need to fear some of the passages which use one law or one statute, but we might need to recalibrate our approach to them. And that should not fear us, because we're not telling people to stop doing what they're doing. Making a few modifications is something which everyone is going to do with his or her theology or understanding of the Bible over the course of a lifetime. So that concludes our discussion for today. And indeed, we're going to wait and see what happens over the weekend. On behalf of Outreach Israel Ministries and Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our ministry efforts. Please do consider signing up for a monthly $25 or $50 donation. It will go a long way. If you have not already, please do visit my website, messianicapologetics.net, where you can access a wide array of articles, frequently asked questions entries. You can access different back episodes of Messianic Insider, back issues of our monthly newsletter, Outreach Israel News. You can take a look at a lot of our other ministry adventures over the years. And certainly be sure to give this episode a thumbs up or a heart. It will definitely help our exposure on social media. We will see you again on Monday with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you. Shabbat Shalom, and take care.